Hi, this is Misha, and in this video I'm actually going to blend two of my interests, NASA and military aircrafts. On the left we have the Northrop T-38 Talon, and on the right we have the Northrop F-5, and this is the F variant, Tiger. And if these look kind of like generic 60s, 70s jet fighters, that's almost by design. This is a very understated aircraft, but actually when you dig into it, it's very interesting. These are both 1/72 scale die-cast models from Hobby Master, so they're appropriate with each other. So let's just jump into it. In the early and mid-50s, designers at Northrop were working on a new supersonic jet fighter. This is right when planes like the F-100 Super Sabre were coming out and going into service. And they were noticing as time went on, jets in America were getting bigger, heavier, more complicated, thus more maintenance intensive, and of course just more expensive. And they kind of wanted to go against the grain and make a small, relatively inexpensive, light, versatile, while at the same time being fast and maneuverable jet fighter. In the very, very beginning, as they just started working on the N-156 project, at that time, around 1954, the U.S. Navy was still operating what are called escort carriers, which are smaller carriers. And so they were thinking this might, fit the bill for the Navy to have a small but effective jet fighter for their escort carriers. Well, this didn't last long because the Navy decided, instead of getting a little jet to fit our little carriers, we'll just retire all of our little carriers and go bigger, bigger, bigger. And that's what they did. So the whole N-156 project was really left without government funding by 1956. Northrop really believed in this, so they decided to kind of target export customers. Also, the line was kind of divided up into the N-156T two-seat trainer, as well as the N-156F single or two-seat fighter. So this is kind of where the lines start to diverge. In 1955, at the time young U.S. Air Force wanted to replace many of its old trainers. Planes like the T-36, also even some older ones like the T-6. They looked at a two-seat version of the Super Sabre, but ultimately ended up going with the N-156T, or as it started to become known, the YT, because it was just frankly more cost effective. It was a dedicated trainer, not just a modified fighter. It had potentially better safety record. And Northrop was real big on basically life cycle costs. And they were able to show that over time this would really save the Air Force money. So they would select it. The first prototype would fly in 1959. It would do quite well. In fact, it would break the sound barrier. And this would go into production. And the first T-38s would be in the Air Force by 1962. The T-38 was the T-38A was the primary two-seat trainer, with the YT-38 or B being a specialized gunnery trainer. Later on we'll have the T-38C, but that comes much later. It was essentially just an updated, modernized version. Northrop would produce nearly 1,200 of the T-38 Talon, most going to the Air Force. However, 32, such as this one here, would go to NASA, who would start using them very early on for astronaut training, as well as using them as chase and research planes. And what do we have here? In either case, be it the Air Force trainer or the one used by NASA. The Navy also had some of these, by the way. We have a two-engine design. The engines are actually very small, compact, but still powerful. So, pretty typical fuselage. The trainer obviously would not be fitted with armament, except for the 38B. This is a very small, fast, maneuverable jet. The trainer here is only about 46 feet long, with a wingspan of just over 25 feet. It could reach 1.3 Mach and climb a little past 50,000 feet. It was really considered very agile, and it was nicknamed the White Rocket. It's estimated that in the Air Force, at least 50,000 pilots have been trained on T-38 Talons over the years. And these were produced primarily from 1962 through 1979. However, as of at least a couple of years ago, over 500 were still in working service in the Air Force, and they're still being used, and these are not slated for retirement until at least 2029. As for NASA, of their 32 planes, 16 are still operational, and they are still being used. Kind of not bad for a project that really people weren't interested in. Luckily, the engineers at Northrop believed in it and provided one of the most iconic trainers out there. These were quite forgiving, easy to handle, easy to maintain, easy to work on, including like swapping the engines out. However, at least 4 astronauts that I can recall were killed in T-38s in the 1960s. However, it really wasn't the plane's fault most of the time. For example, one gentleman was killed because a bird hit the plane. 2 were killed because of heavy fog conditions. So, I mean, unfortunately, incidents happen, especially with individuals who fly a lot. That's just how it is. As far as this Hobbymaster model, this is one of the first ones I picked up because of the whole NASA connection. I just think it's neat. It's a very sleek, little, compact plane. And it's all metal, with only a few details like the pitot tube and part of the external of the engine there being plastic, but the vast majority is metal. So even though it's relatively small, it's got some good weight to it. One neat little thing they did The pilots inside are actually wearing blue jumpsuits instead of green, which is in keeping with NASA. This would definitely be one I would recommend to any NASA enthusiast or just model enthusiast. It's a really neat model. And it just seems well put together and unique. Well, what about the fighter angle? As I said, the idea was to export these to foreign customers. And in 1958, the American government first had the idea, and they were kind of pushed to this idea. Instead of giving foreign allies hand-me-down aircraft, as had been done for years, decades, why not make an aircraft, a brand new design, for what we would call today developing countries, what they used to call back then the Third World. Hey, Third World still sounds better than uncivilized, which is what they would have been called in the 19th century. So, hey, every century we make a little progress, don't we? I digress. And so they considered this. Essentially, they ordered 3 prototypes for testing from Northrop, which they essentially assembled from what was laying around and refurbishing existing prototypes. And they were suitably impressed with this craft. However, this is still in the Eisenhower administration, and interest kind of died down again. And the project really just stagnated for a couple of years. But the folks at Northrop, as usual, did not give up on it. They believed in their plane, so they kept developing it and trying to keep it up to date, as well as trying to just make it better and more cost effective. Interestingly, the Army tried this out in 1961 and really liked it and might have even wanted to buy some, but they couldn't get the Air Force to go along with. After the Army Air Corps became a separate Army Air Force, they were given the mandate to operate fixed-wing aircraft, and the Army was not supposed to. So even though the Army liked this plane, the Air Force had no interest in it. They just didn't. They had all their own little toys, and this wasn't new and flashy. Really what Northrop had come up with was a generic fighter. And that's not a bad thing. It was simple. It was easy to maintain or place parts on. This is a little bit bigger than the trainer. The original version, the one that was out in the early 60s, would have been about 48 foot long with about a 26 foot wingspan. And it would have had a top speed of about Mach 1.6 with a maximum altitude of about 52,000, maybe a little less, feet. So a little better performance envelope. It could mount standard armament under the wings. It had a total of, let's think here in my head, 7 hard points, I believe. The 2 wingtip, and then 2 more under each wing, and then a center line. It also had 2 20mm cannons in the nose. It used the same 2 small engines, which gave good performance. It also meant there was redundancy. So the plane itself, while not an amazing performer, was certainly better than an old hand-me-down plane. So the Army liked it, but they couldn't do much about it. Well, in 1962, the Kennedy administration, who had a lot of new ideas about defense and the military, some good, some not, revived the whole foreign aid fighter program. And this was very quickly selected as the best candidate. I mean, it should be. It had been in development for not quite 10 years, but a long time at this point. And they were ordered to go into production in October of that year. Cuban Missile Crisis, incidentally. And were designated the F-5. The 5A would be the single-seat variant, and the 5B would be the two-seat variant. Now, even though this was kind of targeted at the developing world, especially, East Asia at that time, one of the earliest buyers was actually Norway. The Norwegian Air Force first ordered the F-5, both the A and the B, in 1964. Interesting. This would be followed by Iran, who is, of course, still under the Shah at this time, as well as the Republic of Taiwan, Republic of China, if you will, whatever you'd like to call it, and many others would follow suit. Quite interestingly, in 1965, at first the U.S. Air Force acquired 12 of these for evaluation, and the idea was they would first train Air Force pilots on how to operate the F-5, and then they could train a select group of pilots representing the customers buying these, and then they could go home and train the rest of the Air Force. A good idea. So they evaluated them. But then, in late '65, they began Operation, I always forget the word, Misha Tiger. And this would actually see the Air Force flying F-5s in Vietnam in combat roles for about 5 months. Now, they would have their own variant known as the F-5C, which had Air Force required updates, as well as aerial refueling capability, and so on and so forth. And, of course, this was more evaluation, but it was also a way to show any potential customers buying these, as well as just giving our allies the idea, look, these are actually good planes. They're good enough, we would use them ourselves, and our pilots will risk their lives with them. And they actually performed as good or better than expected, and pilots generally were quite positive about them. This is a smaller, lighter plane than, say, an F-4. Now, on the other hand, it's not as fast, it's not as powerful, and it certainly doesn't have the capacity, but everything's a trade-off. After this, many would be given, or sold, loaned, however you will, to the South Vietnamese government, who would begin operating them in 1967. And these would continue to spread around the world. Another interesting buyer was Switzerland, who just really liked its low cost of operation. This is a very versatile plane. It could be fitted with air-to-air missiles, air-to-surface missiles, guided or unguided bombs, rocket pods, or be set up as a reconnaissance. There was the RF-5 that was a dedicated recon variant. And interestingly, spec-wise, this is very close to the MiG-21 that was seen over the skies of Vietnam. The MiG had a slightly narrower wing. Lengthwise was just about identical. It was a bit faster. It could get over Mach 1.7, nearly 1.8. And one area where it really excelled over the F-5 was in altitude. The MiG-21 could get up to 57,000 feet, whereas, like I said, this couldn't quite make 52. On the other hand, the MiG-21 only had 4 hard points, whereas this had 7. So it had a larger capacity. Also, it had 2 cannon versus the 1 on the MiG. Now, the MiG's was slightly bigger, but this one had 2. So, and it also had more ammunition. Everything's a trade-off, guys. Everything. So, in the end, until this went out of production in the mid-70s, they would build a little under 900 of the F-5s. And it was later on in this one's life that it was nicknamed and then later officially named the Tiger. But it ended up being quite respected and a pretty common aircraft. Even after the toppling of the Shah in Iran, the new government would continue flying F-5s. But this is not the end of the story. In 1970, the U.S. government conducted another competition to select essentially an updated version of an export fighter for Allies, and again Northrop won with a new variant of the F-5, known as the F-5E for single seat, or the F-5F for 2-seat, and that's exactly what we have here. This is a slightly larger craft at about 50 feet long, a little bit heavier. It has a little bit more wing area, slightly more powerful engines, more fuel on board, updated avionics and electronics, a better radar, and a few other little things. But it was just basically an updated F-5. After winning the trial, the first prototype of the updated version would fly in 1972, and these would be in production by 1974. In between that time and 1987, or 1989 as some sources claim, they would build 1,400, including all variants. So it was slightly more, well, a decently bit more successful than the original. And actually, F-5s are still flying in Switzerland, as well as many other places around the world. They're good planes. They do what they need to do. Interestingly, the MiG-21 is still flying. Sometimes when you have a design that's sturdy, if not fancy, it just does the job. I kind of think of this as an early F-16 in the way that they're just kind of a multi-role type fighter. And considering at one time it seemed like maybe no more than 3 prototypes would ever be made of these, the fact that over 2,200 ended up being produced is a pretty good turnaround. I mean, it's a pretty good comeback story. Now this plane here from Hobbymaster, this model, is actually U.S. Navy. The Navy and Marines had some of these, as did the U.S. Air Force. The Air Force used them as aggressor craft, actually for a long time, from 70 or so through 1990. The U.S. Navy used them at their Top Gun school, which is what this is here. So these were used in some type of training or war games capacity for a long time. And the reason I kind of picked this one up from Hobbymaster, they have quite a few F-5s. I like that this one did come with ordnance. I've decided not to put it all on. I can't put on the tank anyway and keep it on the stand. And I'd rather have it on the stand, but here's the kind of the underbelly tank. But I could put these on, but they're huge compared to the plane, and I think it looks really good setting up here with the four missiles. So it's clearly armed, but still has that sleek look to it. No reason to load her down. But I thought this was one of the more interesting model variants that they have on offer. As with pretty much all of theirs, you can put the landing gear up or down. The canopy opens. We have 2 pilot figures. The usual. Then again, the F-5F is probably the biggest of the variants in the family. But even then, we're not huge. We're still a lot smaller than, say, a newer plane like the F-14 or even the F-18. It's a really neat story, and there's a couple of documentaries free to watch on YouTube if you'd like to hear more. It's just kind of neat to see something come out of America that's just not bigger, better, and kind of overhyped and over budget and overextended. This thing was designed in a reasonable time. Didn't cost the whole farm to buy and build, and provided a very economical yet totally respectable airplane for American allies to fly. And heck, they have been flying them for over 50 years in many cases. One thing that's kind of interesting, this was actually Mexico's first supersonic jet fighter. And that happened when they first received some in 1982. In a way, it was kind of, it did bring modern jet technology within range of pretty much any government. Well, folks, I think that should whet your appetite enough on this craft. Any questions or comments, please do feel free to leave them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And check out some of my other videos. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.